Welcome, everyone, to today's Endowment for Middle East Truth webinar discussing the recent lawsuit filed by America Legal First against the Biden administration for its failure to enforce the Taylor Force Act and to stop U.S. funding of Palestinian terrorism. On a personal level, I was ecstatic to hear about this lawsuit, as it seems to me that lawfare may be the only way to get President Biden and his national security team to enforce our laws that were designed to keep Americans safe, both at home and abroad, including their failure to enforce the Taylor Force Act, designed to stop the pay-for-slay policies of the Palestinian Authority that have left not just Israeli citizens, but Americans as well in harm's way. Emmett worked very hard on the passage of the Taylor Force Act, and it's beyond distressing to see the Biden administration now ignoring it and instead sending hundreds of millions of US taxpayer dollars to the PA that is then awarded to Palestinian terrorists and their families. We have with us today two of the plaintiffs in that case, both victims of the Palestinian Authority's policy of paying Arabs to kill Jews, and who worked alongside us in moving the Taylor Force Act forward, as well as one of the lead lawyers in the case. And I look forward to an important and insightful discussion about the issues surrounding this case. As always, I thank you all for joining and for supporting Emmett. We couldn't do what we do if it were not for your generous support. Please consider visiting our website at www.emmettonline.org to make a contribution that will help allow us to continue our important work. Today's webinar will be recorded and the link for viewing will be sent around tomorrow. If you have any questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type them in. I'll do my best to get to as many of them as possible later in the program. Sari, I want to start with you, and thank you so much for joining us. Before I ask you your first question, I just want to share some brief background for our audience. On June 11th in 2003, Sari was on bus 14 in Jerusalem when an 18-year-old Palestinian terrorist boarded the bus and blew himself up. 17 people were killed, including all those seated and standing around Sari, and over 100 people were injured. Sari was hospitalized for 2 weeks and then returned to New Jersey to be with family. She has since appeared on television stations, radio interviews, and spoken before Congress and senators. Sari is the founder and director of Strength to Strength, which focuses on bringing together victims of terrorism together from around the world and assisting with their long-term psychological needs. Sari has addressed audiences throughout the United States, Canada, Europe, South America, and Israel, and continues to share her unique insight into the ongoing struggle for victims of terror in Israel around the world. Sari, can you begin by spending a few minutes discussing your experience on that bus on that fateful day, the impact that it had on you, and whether at the time it ever crossed your mind that the US could have played a role in preventing Palestinian terrorism? I mean, the attack occurred in the middle of the Second Intifada, so Israelis were living through very dangerous times. But I don't think that the US was working on ways to tamp down the violence. Can you share your experience with us, please?
Sure. Thanks, Lori, for having me. I will tell you that that my attack was during a ceasefire. It was June 11, 2003. It was at the height of the Second Intifada, as you mentioned. And I had found out later that President Bush had put a peace plan on the table, and this was Hamas's answer to that peace plan that he had suggested. So whether or not the administration was really full on in terms of trying to counter and prevent terrorism, I'm not really sure. But from my experience, at that time living there, it was rampant on a daily basis of wondering and watching to see what was around you to make sure that something wasn't happening. And unfortunately, there were many, many attacks during that year. That day was a beautiful day. I was on my way home to meet a friend for dinner. I boarded the bus at Machane Yehuda at the marketplace. It was pretty packed. There were lots of people coming home from work as it was the end of the day. It was rush hour. People were picking up groceries and getting on the bus. I originally was standing when I first got on the bus, and when we pulled up to the next stop, which was Machane Yehuda, I ended up seeing 2 empty seats in the front section on the right side, and I ended up sitting down. Now, normally I would have taken the aisle seat knowing that people who get on at Machane Yehuda are carrying packages. If there was someone older, I would have wanted to get up. But for some reason, I took that window seat, and I know that if I didn't take that window seat, I wouldn't be here today. As the bus started moving, I remember the girl who sat down next to me, and her boyfriend was standing holding the 2 poles in between our seats. And I remember just looking outside for a split second. There were literally hundreds of people that were there waiting to catch buses, because the bus stop wasn't just for one bus. There were probably about 10 or 15 buses that went through there to pick up different people. So I remember seeing lots and lots of people outside. And I even remember the bus driver closing the door and people were still trying to get on the bus. So people were really trying to pack themselves in at that time of day. And I was just gotten off the phone with a friend of mine. And as I was looking down in my knapsack on the floor, and I dropped my cell phone in my knapsack as I went to close it, I felt a huge shock wave hit me. And the only way to explain the shock wave is it's like two pieces of metal that hit so hard against each other and vibrate back. That's what I remember my body feeling like. And I remember trying to lift my hands up to my face, and the shock wave was pulling my hands down and my body was being pulled back against the seats. And I didn't think it was a terrorist attack. I thought that we had gotten into a bus accident, that somebody hit me in the face with something. But the last thing I thought was that someone boarded that bus strapped with explosives to hurt and murder innocent people. And when the blast stopped, I couldn't open my left eye at all, because it had already been swollen shut from something that hit it from the bus. And my right eye, I could barely open, just enough to see the roof of the bus had fallen in and the man's head in front of me, and he wasn't moving. And for a split second after that blast, there's this silence. And I always say it's not the silence that you hear in the summertime when the crickets are out. It's literally the silence of death all around you. It's a split second, but it feels like so much longer. And after that silence, that deafening silence, my ears started ringing really loud and I started screaming. And luckily I was screaming because a guy heard me from outside. And I found out that he had been 3 blocks away. He heard the blast. He didn't know what it was, and he came running, because in Israel, when there is something that happens, the Israelis run to the problems, not away from it. This guy didn't know what happened. He heard it. He came running towards the burning bus. He yelled to me that I needed to get out. I said, I can't. He said, put your feet up on the bar, which I thought was the window. And he and another man pulled me out of the bus and brought me to the side of the road, where an old woman waited with me until I was taken to the hospital by I think Magen David Adom. And I remember, thinking afterwards, how did I get out? And literally, it was the bottom of the bus that had blown out from the impact of the blast. I was immediately taken to Hadassah in Kerem. They said that it was lucky I was screaming, because there was a small fire that broke out in the center in the front of the bus afterwards, and they couldn't tell who was unconscious and who was no longer alive. And so it was lucky that I was screaming, because I was conscious the whole time, even though I couldn't see anything. And basically that would help them to get me out very quickly. And while that's sort of almost the end of the story in terms of what happened that day, it was just the beginning of a different life, the beginning of dealing with the long-term impact that thousands of people in Israel and thousands around the world deal with, of the long-term effects of terrorism.
Thank you so much, Sari. I've known you a very long time, and I've known your story. And every time I hear you share your story, it's as emotional as the first time. And your strength is amazing. And I love the fact that you started strength to strength as a result of this horrible, horrible thing, and that you're doing this amazing work, helping other people who have sadly experienced similar tragedies. So thank you for what you do. I'm now going to ask Stuart to also share his experience upon learning that your 28-year-old son, Taylor, a Vanderbilt University graduate student on a 2016 school trip to Israel, walking on the boardwalk in Jaffa, just south of Tel Aviv, was stabbed to death by a Palestinian terrorist. I don't think anyone on this webinar can imagine the shock to learn that your son, who had graduated from West Point and survived tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, was the victim of a terrorist attack in Israel. I understand, Stuart, that you and your wife, Robbie, recently returned from visiting the spot where Taylor was attacked, something that must have been unbelievably difficult and emotional for you both. I do want to add that Stuart also has a distinguished record of service to our country. From 1973 to 1982, he served as an officer and pilot in the United States Air Force and the Colorado Air National Guard. After retiring from the Air Force, he was a commercial pilot for Southwest Airlines until his retirement in 2009. Stuart and Robbie were instrumental in passing the Taylor Force Act, which was aimed at ending the PA's policy of financially rewarding Palestinian terrorists, also known as pay to slay. Since then, Stuart and Robbie have dedicated themselves to honoring their son's memory by working to enact meaningful reform through efforts like the Taylor Force Act. Stuart, can you please share with us some of what you experienced? And again, when did it occur to you that the U.S. maybe could have played a role in stopping Palestinian terrorism?
Thank you. Thank you, Lori. Looking at the picture, I can see that I've aged quite a bit in the last 6 years. On March 8th, my wife and I were living in Charleston, South Carolina. That afternoon, I was at a local golf course close by our house and just putting around in the putting green. And as I walked to my car, my cell phone went off, and I looked down, I recognized the area code, Nashville, where Vanderbilt's located. And I thought to myself that, oh, it's Taylor, borrowed a phone from a friend. He was in Israel on a school trip with 30 classmates. So I answered the phone. I said, hi, in a sort of a nice, easy manner. And the voice on the other end said, is this Stuart Force? And I said, well, yes, it is. And she goes, hello, this is Chaplain Gretchen from Vanderbilt University. I'm on speakerphone in the office of the chancellor, and I have with me the dean of the graduate school. I thought to myself, this is probably not going to be a very good call. She said, Mr. Force, there has been a terrorist attack in Israel on the boardwalk in Jaffa. 11 tourists on the boardwalk were stabbed by a young Palestinian man, and Taylor was one of them. And I'm sorry, Mr. Force, Taylor did not make it. I thought for a second, I said, to myself, what does that mean? And then I realized that Taylor didn't make it. And I said, Chaplain Gretchen, I have 2 questions. First of all, these are questions any parent would ask. Are you sure it was Taylor? She said, yes. The professor verified that it was Taylor. And I said, the second question was, have you contacted my wife at home? And she said, no, Taylor had left your cell phone as the primary contact. I said, that's Taylor. I said, do me a favor. I need to be the one to call Robbie. I'll call you back at this number after I've spoken with and broken the news. So I quickly drove back, called Robbie. She came down from upstairs, and she could tell by the tone of my voice something had happened. I said, Robbie, I just got a phone call from Vanderbilt. Taylor has been killed by a terrorist. So after hugging and crying, and we finally both realized that we needed to call Kristen, Taylor's sister, who was in New York packing to move to London for a job she had accepted. So we first called a good friend of hers in New York, Caroline, and said, Caroline, I've got to make a bad phone call here to Kristen. Can you head over to her apartment? So she ran over to the apartment. I called Kristen, told her she collapsed. I told her that her brother, her best friend in the world, had been murdered. Those were the 2 hardest phone calls I've ever made in my life and ever will make. Kristen flew home that night, and that started months of dealing with the most horrific thing a parent can ever deal with. I'll skip a lot of the details in there. It's a hard thing. About July of 2016, I received an email from a gentleman, Mr. Sander Gerber from New York, who was, I found out later, is a very successful and well-respected member of the financial community, but he's also an Orthodox Jew and very involved in bettering relations between Israel and the United States, and also the father of 7 children. He expressed his condolences in the email and asked if I would be interested in any further information about the terror attack. And I said, thank you for the email. I would please, showing the Palestinians celebrating the death of our son and the proclamation that his murderer was who was killed by the authorities, that he was proclaimed a martyr for Palestinian youth. The second email attachment was a PDF detailing the Palestinian Authority pay for slave program, wherein they monetarily reward terrorists that injure innocent civilians in Israel. So I called Sandra and we spoke, and I thanked him for the information. And he mentioned that he would like me to speak with Senator Lindsey Graham, who just happened to be our South Carolina senator. He said, I've shared the information with him. Senator Graham is very, very upset with the whole situation. So I spoke with Senator Graham, and he said, Stuart, Robbie, you have my deepest condolences. He said, I'm utterly disgusted. He said, send me a letter detailing your thoughts, asking for my help, and we'll address this. So I sent him the letter, and before I knew it, September of 2016, Robbie and I were in Washington, D.C., preparing for a press conference with the senator to introduce legislation addressing pay for slay, cutting off funding that the United States sent to the Palestinian Authority that they were using to pay these terrorist acts. We didn't find out till we were in the airport that it was going to be called the Taylor Force Act. And my wife and I broke down in the airport in Charleston. People were staring at us, wondering what was going on. So we get to Washington, D.C. that morning, and he ushered us into his office, explained the procedure and what to expect during the press conference. Then he shut the door, and the three of us sat there, and he looked at Robbie and I, and he said, Robbie, Stuart, how are you really doing? And I said to him, you know, Senator Graham, when Taylor was on active duty and deployed, we waited for him to come home from his deployments. And I said, we still feel right now that Taylor will be coming home from a deployment. And Senator Graham said, Stuart, Robbie, Taylor is home. It's you that are on deployment, and you will be going home soon. And that put the whole terrible mess in perspective. And it was at that moment that we committed our deployment to the mission of addressing this horrific situation. And so we went into the press conference, and we thought, okay, our job here is done. We become the face of this legislation. Little did we know that started 2 years of travel, speaking with senators, congressmen, administration officials, addressing, gathering. At one point, we addressed a conference of 5,000 people and panel discussions. And it was all due to Sandra Gerber putting us in touch with Senator Graham and Congressman Doug Lamborn in the House side. And I guess you would call Sandra Gerber the catalyst behind the Taylor Force Act.
So, Stuart, I'm sure everybody watching is feeling extremely choked up, as I know I am. And again, your strength and yours and Robbie's strength is tremendous. While these wonderful policymakers may be behind the implementation of the Taylor Force Act, it's you and Robbie that made this happen. And so I want to transition into Julie for just a couple minutes to share with the audience, you know, before we get into the details of the lawsuit, which we will discuss. Can you share with everyone what the Taylor Force Act actually is, and you know, what it says and what it requires of the federal government? And perhaps if you have an opinion, maybe share why you think the Biden administration has chosen not to enforce it. And when I say not enforce it, I want to be clear that since entering office in January of 2021, this administration, according to America First Legal, who you represent, you know, you're working as a lawyer for American First Legal. And I should also add that Julie has a very distinguished legal career, and it would take a lot of time to go through your resume. But I'm thankful that you're working on this case, Julie. Since the Biden administration has been in office, the PA has used over $1 billion US taxpayer dollars to benefit their terrorist activities, among other things. And since we all know that money is fungible, How is Biden getting away with this? And why haven't we heard more of a backlash in mainstream circles, let alone from Congress, as their will is being ignored?
So there's a lot there in your questions, and let me just take it in order. First of all, I am so humbled, as is everyone else at America First Legal, where I'm senior counsel, to be representing the forces, Sari Singer and Congressman Ronnie Jackson. I will say that I'm quite the old lady. I have been practicing law for many, many, many years in different areas. And this is perhaps one of the most humbling experiences and honors for me, and along with others at America First Legal, to first know Sari and Robbie and Stewart, as well as Congressman Jackson, and for America First Legal to represent them. So it's a very, very big deal for people to step forward and say, here I am, I will take this on. It's easy. It's easy not to be a plaintiff. It's hard to be a plaintiff, and it's hard to have your name out there. And the circumstances behind it are so powerfully sad. Just hearing Sari talk about when you say the silence of death is all around you. And this is an experience of one woman, and the same with you, Stewart and Robbie, and getting the single most devastating call of your lifetime. And to know that this is actually celebrated by the Palestinian Authority, incentivizing by the Palestinian Authority, and to get to your point, Lori, and we can talk about it in more detail later, the Biden administration is not only A-okay with this, but they're helping to fund it. And that's in essence what this lawsuit's about. So to pick up on Stewart's sort of narrative of what happened, and I know Sander Gerber very well. We're good friends, and Sander is actually the person who coined the phrase "pay to slay," because in those 3 words, it says everything, right? You don't need paragraphs of description. When you have a governmental authority actually paying people to kill other people, celebrating them, incentivizing and motivating them, it's well articulated and captured when you use the term "pay to slay." So what does the Taylor Force Act do? So essentially, what it does is it prohibits the United States government from making any payments out of the fund called the Economic Support Fund, either by grant or direct funding, so forth, any monies that directly benefit, and those are terms used in the actual act, the Palestinian Authority, unless and until 4 very clear mechanisms are put in place by the Palestinian Authority. And let me digress for a minute and say that this bill was introduced by Senator Graham, as you said, Stewart, on the Senate side, and there were 33 co-sponsors, 22 of whom were Republican. On the House side, it was introduced by Congressman Lee Zeldin. I believe there were 169 co-sponsors, 155 of whom were Republican. Now, one would think this would have been 100 senators, 453 on the House side. I don't really have a good answer for that, other than those are just the facts. And so these 4 conditions are very granular. And meant to really address what was going on that needed to be remedied by the Palestinian Authority in order for funds to directly support the Palestinian Authority to flow. And the State Department is charged with certifying to Congress that, number 1, credible steps by the Palestinian Authority have been undertaken to actually stop the violence. The second is that the payments themselves have been terminated, so pay to slay is no more. The third is that any laws or provisions or proclamations, whatever they may call them, authorizing this whole martyr fund, they too have all been revoked. And last but not least, that the Palestinian Authority actually has to make an overt ongoing effort to say we disavow terrorism and we condemn it. So those are the four conditions. And if all of those four conditions are not able to be made and so certified by the State Department, then in fact, according to the Taylor Force Act, no money should go under this economic support fund. So the bill is introduced, as Stuart said, it passes, and President Trump signed the bill in March of 2018. In fact, the Trump administration State Department said, we can't certify because that's not what's happening. In fact, pay to slay is happening. The proclamations are still in place. Abbas publicly says, no, we're good with all of this in his own verbiage. And none of the laws, proclamations, decrees, whatever, are discontinued. So the Trump administration stops the funding. Unfortunately, fast forward after the Trump administration, even as back as, I don't know, May or August, whenever it was, 2020, candidate Biden very publicly said, we're going to reverse what the Trump administration has done with respect to the PA, because we all remember that the U.S. Embassy was grown, was closed and made a part of U.S. Embassy Jerusalem. The PLO office was closed in DC. So the Trump administration took very, very concrete action to disincentivize the Palestinian Authority. So as I said, when candidate Biden was campaigning, he said, we're going to reverse all of this. And that September, before the election, Congressman Lamborn, who was referenced earlier, basically said to candidate Biden, you can't do both here. You cannot restore funding to the PA and be in compliance with the Taylor Force Act. It's one or the other. So clearly, we know what the Biden administration chose to do. And it basically had three goals when it took office. One, to resume payments to the PA in violation, in our opinion, the opinion of America First Legal and other scholars, of violating the Taylor Force Act. Number two, we wanted to reopen a consulate in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, to the Palestinians, despite the fact that U.S. Embassy Jerusalem is in Jerusalem and that there is an office for the Palestinians that's dedicated. And in addition to that, they want the administration wants to reopen the PLO office in DC. So in terms of the three of them, number one has occurred, and that's what we're talking about today. These payments have been resumed. While the U.S. consulate to the Palestinians in Jerusalem itself has not opened, it is not opened because the Israeli government, as the sovereign power, it is a sovereign country, said, no, we're not permitting that, despite significant pressure by our government. So what Biden did, sort of like, let's do indirectly what we can't do directly, is he did open an office to the Palestinians, not a consulate, but an office to the Palestinians in Jerusalem. And he made Hadi Amr, who is quite a devotee of the Palestinian Authority, special envoy to the Palestinians. So he reports directly back to the State Department and can go right around U.S. Embassy Jerusalem. The PLO office has not yet been reopened. So I can get into more of what the administration's doing, but I'm going to let you sort of guide the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Julie. That was insightful, and we'll get into the details of the actual lawsuit in a couple minutes. But I want to go back to Sari and Stuart, and I want to ask you both to share what went through each of your minds when the Taylor Force Act, which garnered bipartisan support in Congress, as you shared the numbers, Julie, was finally signed into law by President Trump in 2018, when his administration finally froze all amounts of U.S. dollars from being sent to the corrupt PA. Did you have a sense of relief, accomplishment on your end, Stuart? Was hope that maybe there could finally be a winding down of some of the terrorist activities that have been so devastating? And were you surprised that the Biden administration is not only not enforcing the legislation, but is actually violating the letter of the law by giving the Palestinians all this money to use to further their terrorist activities, which, by the way, and Julie, you and I had spoken about this earlier today, are increased tremendously. And in this past year, this administration seems not to care. The numbers of terrorist attacks that are just all over, it seems, all the time we're looking at our phones or on their screens, there's more attacks. I also want to point out, this is important, I think, that the Biden administration just condemned Israel for giving $39 million in collected tax revenues to Israeli victims of terrorism, rather than to the Palestinian terrorists, which in any sane world would be recognized as the right policy, but under this current tag team of foreign policy officials in Washington is deemed problematic for fear it will, quote unquote, exacerbate tensions, as if the over $1 billion that they have infused into the PA has resulted in peace and calm. So, Sari, we'll start with you, and if you can just address some of what I've just
Sure.
Go to start.
Sure. I mean, for me, I will say that I was beyond happy to see the movement, but the actual signing into law of the Taylor Force Act for a number of reasons. First of all, I had spent many years coming to Washington and speaking to legislatures about what I had been through and about the fact of my biggest issue is the terror financing, especially when I came back after I lived in Israel a year after the attack. But when I did come back here, I was looking for ways to fight back. And the one way that I wanted to do that was through the legal system and stopping the terror financing. And so to see something like this come to fruition and to be a reality of the acknowledgement that in order to stop the terrorism, you need to stop the financing, which this is part of it, was something that I was really happy to see. The problem is that, and what is bigger than all of us is that it's not just the United States, that I've spoken in front of members of parliament in the UK about the financing of terror, and the fact that when the money leaves the hands of these governments, including our own government, there's no accountability on where that money goes. And that's why it's able to go towards the Pay for Slay program. And the fact is that if governments and banks had more oversight on these issues and were able to know exactly where that money was going and account for it, there may be less reasons for these to happen. Now, that's an ideal world. That would be wonderful. But we know in reality that no one is going to monitor exactly where that money goes. But there are countries all around the world that are giving foreign aid, and that money is going to help not only pay for slay stuff, but also financing the terrorist attacks themselves down to the littlest details. And I think this is this was a start for the US, but by means for me was not just the end of what needs to be done, but the beginning of an acknowledgement and accountability of what's really happening. And the forces really made that happen, unfortunately, through such a horrific experience. And I always say that what I'm doing and everything that I'm on here is not just about me. It's about the 17 innocent people that were on my bus that didn't get to go home to their family members that day. Everything I do is in memory of them because they don't have their voice, and I need to be that voice for them. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that fact that, you're meeting two of us on this call. There are thousands and thousands of people that are going through the same things. And to know that our governments are having some sort of connection to this, it is horrible. And I want to be the idealistic person to say that, no, they don't know what they're doing. I'd like to say the administration doesn't really think that this is what they're doing, but they know what's going on. And they're turning that blind eye for other political reasons. And when it comes to human lives and American lives, and I said this after the attack, and I'll say it again, my attack is coming up on 20 years. No matter where I am in the world, I expect my president, no matter if it's a Republican president or if it's a Democrat president, or if it's any other president in any other, way that they want to identify themselves, independent or whatever, my president should be protecting me no matter where I am in the world. And when this money is going over to finance and to incentivize terrorism, this is not my president and not my country protecting every American citizen wherever they are. And I think that's the point of this. There needs to be more accountability, and we as American citizens need to be putting forth and saying to our representatives that there needs to be more accountability. It can't just be the victims, making statements and us coming out. It needs to be every single American putting their voice forward and saying that we do not want this happening, because God forbid anyone else has to go through this. You don't want to be in the situation that we're in. So everybody should really be responsible for this, not just those of us who have been directly impacted.
So Lori, can I jump in and just, am I going to distract you? So I think there's something that's very important that Sari said, and I would encourage anybody who is on this Zoom now or who later watches the program on YouTube or wherever it's posted. Every single one of the viewers on this Zoom has a responsibility to pick up the phone and call his or her senators and congressmen or congresswomen and say, I saw this. I know what America First Legal did. I need you to put pressure on the administration, because this administration knows exactly what it's doing. So while the Biden administration State Department and Antony Blinken say, oh, we completely oppose the Martyr Fund, which is the name of the fund that basically doles out the money. And as long as you provide, I mean, it's literally like a sort of fill out the form. How many did you kill? How old they were, this, that, and the other. The greater the monies that these people and or their families receive, right? So they say that they're against it, but at the same time, A, they can't certify, and B, they say, well, we're really not giving money to the PA, we're giving it to an NGO. And I can, go into that. I could see you want to ask a question.
Well, so I do, because I do, we have a lot to get to, and there's a lot of questions in the queue, and we still have a lot to get to. So we're going to come back to you, Julie, in a couple minutes to actually talk about the litigation. Stuart, I want to pose to you a similar question to I would love for you to address the question that I posed to Sari, but I also, again, given the time constraints, I'm going to throw something else out at you. And I'm going to ask you to share with us what other things you and Robbie are working on to either fight terrorism or promote U.S. policy that focuses on keeping Americans safe, whether at home or abroad, which is what Sari, that important point that you brought up, Sari. And, Stuart, I think what a lot of people, maybe the apathy comes from, well, if you're not Jewish and living in Israel, you're safe from the Palestinian terrorism. I mean, within your faith community, Stuart, do you find that people have rallied to your cause? Because again, one can fall under this false belief that terrorism in Israel only affects Jews who live there, so why should Americans care? But your story runs completely counter to that. So are you reaching parts of America outside of the Jewish community who understand how this affects everyone?
I'll start from your first question. What did we experience when the law was passed? For us, that was the pure definition of a bittersweet moment. It was sweet that the law was passed and enacted, and we felt elated for not only ourselves, but the thousands of people and organizations. I won't start to name organizations. There are so many, and I don't want to leave anybody out. But that was a very sweet moment for us. And obviously, the bitter part was that it was called the Taylor Force Act. When we first realized, and it was pointed out to us, that the payments to the Palestinian Authority were resuming, was I surprised in light of the rest of the decisions that have been made by the current administration? I wasn't surprised a bit. I can't imagine them not the administration, President Biden and Secretary Blinken, not understanding that any money they send is going to end up either in the Palestinian Authority's hands, or, as Ansari said, being used to purchase weapons, being used against Israel. From the moment its independence was proclaimed by the United Nations, it has been waging a battle against the surrounding Arab countries. Fast forward, as you said, 70 years, the Arab neighbors are realizing that Israel, it's not its enemy, Israel is in truth should be a working partner. By the Biden administration sending money over there, supporting the Palestinian Authority and therefore the terrorist organizations. They're continuing to inflame the situation and working against the whole peace process that the Abraham Accords have made at least a beginning in the process. Robbie and I are continuing to any avenue open to us to advance what the aims of the Taylor Force Act are, whether it be through legal actions, whether it be through speaking, meeting. We are open to everything. With the latest legislation that Senator Cotton and Congressman Lamborn have offered, the Taylor Force Martyr Payment Prevention Act, a long word, to address the money laundering of foreign assets through the U.S. banking system to send American dollars to the terrorist organizations. That is ongoing. It's going to be reintroduced in this session of Congress. It's such a bizarre situation when the terrorist organizations proclaim death to Israel, death to the United States, but yet they want US dollars to pay for their munitions and to pay their terrorists. Our reception, when Robbie and I go out and we speak to people or in the course of our normal daily lives, we are very judicious. We don't want to be in a situation where we bring people down talking about our murdered son. But when we do share Taylor and the story of the Taylor Force Act, the reception and the reaction has been so positive and supportive. And that's what we felt during the whole process. And we will be eternally grateful to those that have been there for us.
Well, we here at AMET and on this webinar today as well are eternally grateful for the strength and work that you and Robbie are doing, and you, Sari, as well. We at AMET, we did honor Robbie and Stuart at our Rays of Light in the Darkness dinner as really heroes for the Jewish people, for Americans, for people the world over. And you deserved that honor, and I'll never forget, there was a room of over 400 people that were, that certainly stood up and gave you resounding support, applause and support for the great work that you do, and we thank you for that. Julie, I want you now to, go into, if you can share with us more about the actual litigation. I know that it's very early in its process. There's hurdles that have to be crossed before you can get into the meat of it, but can you share with us what the claims are and how you intend to prove them, as well as to force the Biden administration to enforce the law? Again, there's so many federal laws on the books that this administration is not enforcing. So how is this case different, and one in which the plaintiffs have an opportunity to force the administration to do the right thing and actually protect American citizens through enforcement of laws that are already on the books? And it's my understanding that the State Department has concluded that the pay-for-slay policy remains in place. So on what basis does it claim it's in compliance with federal law then?
Okay, so I'm going to take it in a little bit of different order here because there's a lot there. So in essence, what we are saying is that the plaintiffs here, Sari, Robert, Robbie, and Stuart, as well as Congressman Jackson, who, by the way, is a congressman from the district where Taylor was born, Lubbock, Texas. All of them have standing to bring this lawsuit because they are concretely and directly affected by the violation of the Taylor Force Act by the Biden administration. Let me digress a minute and say that what Congress did when it passed the law is it made a very clear finding and statement. And I'll read it to you because it's important to get the language exactly correctly. It says the Palestinian Authority's practice of paying salaries to terrorists serving in Israeli prisons, as well as families of deceased terrorists, is an incentive to commit acts of terror. So there is a direct cause and effect. And we know that 2022 was the deadliest year in terms of acts of terrorism in Judea and Samaria since 2006. So we see this cause and effect. The Biden administration has resumed payments. And I can tell you that as of March 2022, the State Department publicized a fact sheet admitting that over $500 million with a B dollars has flown to the Palestinian Authority. So this is not, some major coincidence of what's happened. Basically, what the Biden administration says is, yeah, we oppose the Martyr Fund, we oppose this activity, but we're not violating the Taylor Force Act because what we're doing is we're giving money to NGOs for humanitarian purposes. We all know, first of all, money is fungible. Second of all, monies that the Palestinian Authority gets they move money in a cash system. And not only that, but these NGOs to which the Biden administration refers, in March of 2021, the Palestinian Authority issued something called a law by decree. And they basically said, any NGO within our jurisdiction, it's within our control. So if they're controlling the NGOs, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory what's going on here. And so we believe that there's a prima facie case. There's a case on its face that demonstrates that this administration is violating the law. And basically, we asked the federal court, and we filed in the Northern District of Texas, which is where Congressman Jackson's local Texas office is based, to declare, in fact, that there is a violation by this administration of the Taylor Force Act. In addition to that, we seek a cessation of these payments immediately, that the administration be enjoined from doling out money, and that they be permanently enjoined from doing so until such time as the administration can meet the actual very clear terms of the Taylor Force Act, which I ran through earlier, those 4 important aspects. And if they can't do it, then they should not be able to resume payment. So again, we want the court to say, yes, we are declaring that there is a violation. We have found so. Stop it, and you can't resume it until you comply with the law.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Yeah, here, exactly.
And I will say this, we at America First Legal handles a variety of litigation, oversight, and so forth, because as you alluded to, Lori, this administration is not a stranger to violating federal law. This is a different case for AFL, and we think it's incredibly important. I mean, violation of law by any administration obviously should not be tolerated, but we see the result of what happens with the violation of the Taylor Force Act. And that's why we're so committed to this lawsuit.
Thank you. It's so important that you're doing this, Julie, and I'm going to follow it closely. Before we move on to the Q&A, Sari, I wanted you to just talk about your strength to strength work generally, but also whether you've come to any conclusions about the role that the U.S. can play in helping to end terrorism across the globe. Are the victims with whom you work from particular geographic regions? Does the U.S. have either a physical presence or otherwise support entities that are committing terrorist atrocities? Are there other steps you'd like to see the U.S. take, whether president, Congress, military, or other agencies that can help put an end to this? And feel free to talk about the role that you think the U.S. should be playing in the conflict with the Israelis and Palestinians in the context of this, because it seems to me that Trump's policies helped reduce terrorism in Israel, and since Biden's been back in office, it's re-empowered the Palestinians.
Lots of questions there. I'll start off briefly. Strength to Strength is an all volunteer-driven organization. We work with victims of terrorism in 15 different countries around the world. It doesn't matter what your religion is, what your background. If you're a civilian victim of a terrorist attack and there is an organization on the ground working with civilian victims, we will work with you. And we basically provide peer-to-peer support and connecting victims around the world, showing that terrorism isn't just one country's problem, it's a world problem. And we all need to combat that hate And the best way for victims to do that is for us to come together and live our lives the best way we can, showing love and kindness instead of the hate that we all have experienced. And so we run various programs throughout the year with all different organizations and countries throughout different, I mean, we can go through it between, Europe, South America, the Middle East. And we're really working directly with the organizations that are working with those that have been impacted directly by terror. And I think for me, it was really important to focus on the victims and their long-term needs, because so much, especially in the media, is always focused on the perpetrators. And the truth is, most people don't realize that an attack happens in an instant, but the impact lasts a lifetime. And just because we go through this doesn't mean that in a year or two from now, everyone's okay. It is a life struggle. I don't think it ever goes away, but we learn how to cope with it to move forward as best we can. And everyone has their own ways of coping and dealing. What we provide is a safe space for those who want. Again, I never push anybody, but whoever wants to join us, who's a civilian victim and wants to come to our programs. We run retreats, we run victim survivor exchanges. We run different programs on anniversaries and help the survivors get through it. Anything we can do that is not already being done through support services of government or social service agencies that are supposed to be doing this, we kind of come in and help with some of those things. And I think that sort of leads into what you said about my experience globally, because I'm able to do things that I wouldn't normally have ever done in my life because of this experience. And the connections I've made with victims, and I'm going to apologize for my office phone going off as this is happening. I can't pick it up, so I apologize, guys. But basically, it's given me the opportunity to meet some of the most amazing people all around the world that have been directly impacted by terrorism that have become a part of my family. And it doesn't matter what religion we are. I've been to anniversary events and I've spoken in Northern Ireland, in Amsterdam, in Paris, in Brussels, in Madrid a number of times. And it doesn't matter that my attack happened in Israel and their attack happened in Madrid in 2004 in the train, and mine was on a bus. We've experienced terrorism and something that's happened that bonds us for life. And that really supersedes anything else. And so, when I'm overseas, I'm representing, I feel like I'm an American, but I'm representing Israel in everywhere that I speak and I share about the struggle for Israel and what's going on in terms of the victims there. But I'm also representing thousands of other victims that are in our organization from other countries around the world. And I think that I don't want to pinpoint and say what America could do or what the US could be doing better, because the problem is that until the world and until the US and our elected officials can acknowledge and actually call out those that are perpetrating these attacks and call them what they are and use the language of what they are, which is terrorists, because I get a lot of different things that are said to me. Oh, they're not terrorists, they're freedom fighters. No. Hamas is a terrorist organization who has carried out attacks on thousands and thousands of innocent civilians. End of discussion. And until we can get all of our elected officials to actually admit to that, not only, and again, I don't differentiate between Hamas, Hezbollah, Al Qaeda, Boko Haram, ISIS, any of them, all of them are the same to me. But until our elected officials can come together and agree completely on who these people are and what needs to be done, there's no way that we're going to combat this. And the start is the terror financing, but it's sad that it takes victims to go to court, because I'm on a number of court cases against banks that are helping to finance terrorism. It's sad that we as victims have to go through this traumatic experience of dealing with this in the court system, whether it's through depositions, whether it's through the trials, instead of our elected officials being our voice in doing this. And that's my real problem here, is that we do have some that are out there and there are supporters and we love them and they're doing great things, but there are a number of elected officials that when I've spoken to them and I've gone to DC and had conversations, happens, it's as if my words are falling on deaf ears, and that's a big problem. And so I do not believe that the U.S. can actively be the entity to stop this terrorism until they can all acknowledge, all of our elected officials can acknowledge what this is, and then they need to be the leading force for the other countries to come together as one unit and everybody to be combating terrorism together. It's not just about the US, it's about every single country doing that.
Thank you, Sari. A lot of people are asking how to contact their respective representatives in Congress. Someone else asked if there's a template of a letter that they could use to send to their representative on the topic of enforcement of Taylor Force. And Hussein, if you could put maybe Morgan's email address in the chat, and then I would ask anybody listening that wants to know, or maybe when we send out the recording of this webinar, we could give you contact information to reach out to us, and we will help you get in touch with your Congress people, and we could certainly come up with a template letter for you all to send. I think that's a terrific idea, and I thank the person that suggested that.
And Lori, I would suggest, if you want, you have a copy of the complaint. Anybody can download it from the America First Legal website under where our press releases are. The complaint very clearly sets forth the history behind the Taylor Force Act, what the Biden administration is doing, the monies that have flown, in order of all the way this is all unfolded, and that's just good background to have. And so you get a bit more of a deeper dive than we had time for today.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I know that there were a lot of comments in the chat section. People seem, not surprisingly, very emotional over this, and there were more comments than there were actual questions. And Stuart, I want to give you a chance to give some, impassioned, which is probably not difficult to do given what we're talking about here. But your final thoughts, on the topic before we have to close, because I think that your story is just so critically important and meaningful.
Well, first I want to echo Sari's comment that this when somebody's affected by terror, it doesn't go away. You become a member of a club, and a club you never wanted to join. When we lost Taylor, it was on March 8th, which coincidentally was his cousin's birthday. So we had to call my brother-in-law as they were on a plane to Dallas to celebrate Chase's birthday, 3 months apart. You will be impacted by something like this the rest of your life, every waking moment. And it takes pressure. It takes pressure on to acquaint people. People don't want to hear sad stories. They don't want to hear bad news, but you need to tell people and share the stories to get them to understand how important it is to address it, to take care of this. We're committed, Robbie and I. It's been tough. Something people cannot imagine. When I see people on TV that have lost a child in say a school shooting or something, and they dedicate their lives to righting a wrong. Until it happened to us, I didn't understand, but we understand, and we are totally supportive.
I access it on chase.com.
And I appreciate, Robbie and I appreciate, and our daughter Kristen appreciate all the support that we've had, and we'll continue. Our deployment's not done yet, and we'll continue the mission. It's just that's our life.
No, I printed it out.
But thank you.
To Chicago.
Thank you for having us on.
It's on Zelle. I had to pay.
Sorry, mute your.
That's why.
Sorry, mute. So I want to thank everybody. I'm so sorry it's 2:00 and I didn't get to the questions that some of you presented. There were Julie's email address is in the chat, and Morgan Munchnick, who is our Director of Operations is also, his email is there. So if you have, somebody asked Julie about filing an amicus brief, I said that they should get in touch with you directly. Again, with regard to reaching out to your senators and Congress people, you can get in touch with any of us. Again, our Director of Operations email address is in the chat. There was questions about whether Jewish organizations are supporting this. Julie, I don't know if you've gotten any amicus briefs or otherwise support from Jewish organizations.
Look, I think actions speak louder than words. So whatever organizations want to step up, they are more than welcome. We've had some very positive press for those in the non-mainstream media who actually, acknowledge what the Biden administration's doing. So, we're talking the usual suspects of those who actually pay attention to what's going on in an objective manner. So the coverage has been positive for those that we would normally expect to cover it. And that's why it's really, really crucial that everybody speak up and even call Congressman Cotton, Senator Cotton's office and other senators and say, hey, you need to find out what Senator Cotton's doing, because this push is crucial and we have to keep pushing.
So everybody, I do want to share with those of you that are not looking at the Q&A that the comments have been unbelievably supportive, and everybody is thanking the three of you for all that you do and for this in particular. And somebody said that even if you're not aware of it, Stuart and Sari, that there are people supporting you and behind you, and can't thank you enough for all that you do. And I want to thank everybody for joining this afternoon. Please share the recording of this far and wide. It's a critically important topic. And thank you to Julie, Stuart, and Sari for joining us today. I wish you all the best.
And thank you.
Honor.
Thank you guys for bringing this issue to light and for having us here for people to hear what's really going on. Very important.
Yes, I agree.
I can say one thing. It's not a Jewish problem. It's not a Christian problem. We're all in this together, and it's not going to get better unless we all do something. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen, Stuart.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.